Welcome back to RAUL Effect. If you've ever wondered why an avoidant suddenly starts paying attention only after you stop chasing, today's video will uncover the psychology behind that shift. What if the biggest change in an avoidant doesn't begin when you chase harder, but when you quietly stop chasing altogether? Today we'll explore the hidden psychology behind that shift and why reclaiming your own emotional balance changes everything. This is where the entire dynamic begins to change in a way that becomes impossible to ignore. In most anxious avoidant or empath avoidant relationships, the foundation is rarely about the depth of love. More often, it is built on predictability. The avoidant grows accustomed to a relationship where distance carries very little consequence. Pulling away does not lead to real loss, because the other person repeatedly closes the gap, softens the impact, explains the behavior, and keeps the connection alive through constant emotional effort. When that pattern quietly disappears, not through manipulation, punishment, or mind games, but because the other person simply stops over-investing, everything starts to shift. Suddenly, emotional access is no longer automatic. At first, the avoidant may barely notice. They may assume the other person is just busy, distracted, or giving them space. Their internal expectation is that the familiar cycle will eventually return. But what slowly becomes impossible to ignore is the absence of old behaviors. There are no repeated check-ins, no emotional chasing, no lengthy explanations trying to repair the relationship, and no one working overtime to restore closeness. Instead, there is calm consistency without over-functioning. For perhaps the first time in a long while, the avoidant is left alone with the emotional space their distance creates. No one rushes in to remove the discomfort. That is where a quieter form of awareness begins. It is not immediate panic or dramatic regret. It is the realization that something feels different, yet there is no familiar pattern to resolve it. The emotional responsibility shifts inward. That matters because avoidant people are often less afraid of intimacy itself than they are of emotional pressure or feeling overwhelmed. What they are unfamiliar with is a relationship that continues peacefully without revolving around their inconsistency. Once the other person stops compensating for every withdrawal, the avoidant is no longer managing someone else's emotions. They are facing the natural consequences of their own behavior. This creates room for genuine reflection, not because anyone forced it, but because silence leaves fewer distractions. At the same time, it is important to stay realistic. None of this guarantees personal growth or lasting change. It does not magically transform emotional avoidance into emotional availability. What it does accomplish is removing the illusion of stability that was previously maintained through one person's constant effort. The avoidant is now experiencing the real impact of their absence without someone cushioning every emotional gap. There is no one translating distance into endless understanding or reassuring them that everything is fine. There is simply reality. Something equally important begins happening within the empath. Instead of becoming resentful or emotionally shutting down, they develop clarity. They recognize how much energy they spent maintaining a connection that depended on imbalance. They begin to understand the difference between compassion and self-sacrifice. Rather than trying to solve inconsistency, they simply observe it. Patterns become more meaningful than isolated moments. Consistent actions matter more than hopeful potential. Because of that realization, their emotional availability naturally changes. They no longer give unlimited access simply because they care. Their boundaries become healthier and more aligned with reality. When consistency is present, they move closer. When communication becomes vague, they allow space. When the avoidant withdraws, they no longer chase. They simply remain grounded. That is often when the avoidant experiences something unfamiliar. The predictable rhythm of withdraw, wait, reconnect, and reset no longer works. The cycle cannot continue because the other person is no longer restoring balance through emotional pursuit. Different avoidants react differently. Some create even more distance to see whether the old pattern returns. Others send small, low-effort messages to test whether the connection is still available. Some move back and forth between curiosity and detachment, uncertain whether anything has truly changed. Beneath every response is the same experience, uncertainty that someone else is no longer fixing for them. When uncertainty remains unresolved, it naturally demands attention, not always action, but attention. Meanwhile, the empath has shifted out of emotional urgency. They stop analyzing every message, every silence, and every change in behavior. They are no longer searching for hidden meanings behind every interaction. They simply observe from a place of emotional stability. This is the real turning point. It is not the moment the avoidant notices something different. It is the moment the empath stops abandoning themselves to preserve the relationship. From then on, the connection survives only if both people participate equally. If consistency develops, the relationship has room to grow. If inconsistency continues, emotional hope alone can no longer hold everything together. Over time, only two paths usually remain. Either the avoidant gradually learns that genuine connection requires reliability and emotional presence, or they leave because they can no longer depend on guaranteed access without mutual effort. Regardless of which outcome happens, the empath has already changed. They are no longer organizing their emotional world around another person's unpredictability. They are no longer trying to repair every absence through self-sacrifice. Instead, they remain emotionally open without overextending themselves. That distinction changes everything. Because what truly keeps avoidant patterns comfortable is not love. It is certainty. The quiet expectation that someone will always stay, always explain, always fill the emotional gaps, and always make the relationship work regardless of inconsistency. Once that certainty disappears, complacency often gives way to curiosity. And within avoidant psychology, curiosity frequently creates more movement than constant availability ever could. Avoidant individuals are often drawn toward relationships that feel emotionally balanced rather than emotionally consuming. They become more aware of what is no longer guaranteed, what is no longer automatically theirs, and what now requires genuine consistency instead of predictable access. That is where the dynamic finally changes. Not because anyone played a game, but because emotional balance replaced emotional overcompensation, allowing the relationship to stand on mutual presence instead of one person's endless effort. The mind naturally becomes more engaged when it is no longer flooded with constant emotional certainty. A quiet psychological shift takes place. When something is always there, the nervous system gradually stops paying close attention to it. It fades into the background because it feels permanent. But the moment that availability is no longer guaranteed, the brain begins to reassess its importance. Often, this happens beneath conscious awareness through increased attention, subtle comparison, and a growing awareness of what may be slipping away. This is where many people misunderstand relationships. They believe that giving more love, more reassurance, and more emotional availability will automatically create greater security. They assume that if they keep showing up with complete openness, the relationship will naturally become stronger. But within many avoidant relationship patterns, unlimited emotional availability can actually reduce engagement. When there is nothing left to question, pursue, or discover, the emotional system loses the contrast that keeps it mentally invested. That does not mean the relationship lacked value or that the other person was unworthy. It simply means that some attachment systems stop paying attention when everything feels permanently secure. Over time, what becomes completely predictable is no longer actively appreciated. It is simply expected. Everything begins to change when the empath, who once over-explained, overgave, stayed too long, and carried the emotional weight of the relationship, starts making healthier choices. This is not a dramatic withdrawal or a calculated attempt to create distance. It is a quiet shift in where their emotional energy is invested and where it is no longer spent. The avoidant gradually realizes that emotional access is no longer automatic. Something that was once freely available now depends on consistency, effort, and genuine presence. That introduces an unfamiliar experience: limitation. Scarcity does more than reduce availability. It changes perception. Emotional value that once blended into the background suddenly becomes noticeable because it is no longer endlessly offered. This is also why the situation is often misunderstood. It is not manipulation. It is not someone pulling away to trigger pursuit or manufacture a reaction. Manipulation always serves a hidden objective. What is happening here is something much healthier. It is self-correction. The empath is no longer carrying responsibilities that belong to both people. Their compassion remains, their capacity for love remains, but their habit of abandoning themselves disappears. The avoidant can often sense the difference. There is a noticeable contrast between someone creating distance to gain attention and someone stepping back because they refuse to participate in emotional imbalance any longer. The first situation can usually be repaired with temporary reassurance or brief moments of closeness. The second cannot, because now the relationship operates differently. Emotional access is no longer assumed. It is earned through consistent behavior. Communication changes as well. There are no emotional explosions, endless confrontations, or repeated attempts to force clarity from someone who continues offering uncertainty. Instead, thoughts are expressed calmly, honestly, and only when necessary. Once those feelings are communicated, attention shifts away from explanations and toward actions. The empath begins to understand something essential. Affection without consistency never creates emotional safety. It creates dependence on unpredictability, and unpredictability eventually becomes emotionally draining. Because of that realization, they stop rebuilding trust with promises alone. They stop accepting words that are unsupported by actions. They stop treating potential as though it already exists. They also stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional reliability. Instead, they quietly observe. They pay attention to patterns rather than possibilities. They invest less energy in imagining what could happen and far more attention to what repeatedly does happen. When behavior and words fail to match, they adjust naturally. Not as punishment, not as revenge, but because reality deserves a response. There is no dramatic goodbye, no emotional speech, and no attempt to force understanding. There is simply a gradual release of emotional dependence on inconsistency. That is often when the avoidant notices the biggest change, not during conflict or emotional breakdowns, but when access itself begins to feel different. The connection no longer continues on autopilot. It now responds to behavior. Everything about the relationship feels different. What once seemed endlessly available now has healthy structure. What once accepted every inconsistency now has boundaries. What once required little reflection now invites genuine awareness. The avoidant is no longer operating inside familiar conditions. Unlimited access without emotional responsibility no longer exists. Returning whenever convenient no longer restores everything automatically. The relationship begins adjusting to reality instead of assumptions. Whether that leads to a healthier connection or greater distance depends on one thing alone: whether consistency can replace expectation as the foundation of the relationship. This is often the stage where the avoidant becomes more attentive. They may reach out more often, become more responsive, or show increased interest. Not necessarily because they have experienced a complete emotional transformation, but because the system itself has changed. The steady emotional support they once relied on without fully noticing is no longer constantly available. The patience, the understanding, the regular check-ins, the emotional softness, and the willingness to absorb inconsistency have all become more balanced. The quiet emotional labor that held the relationship together is no longer being offered without limits. That absence creates a psychological vacuum, and naturally, attention moves toward whatever has changed. Still, this should not automatically be mistaken for emotional growth. More often, it is recalibration. The avoidant is responding to a change in the emotional environment, not necessarily developing immediate emotional insight. The deepest transformation is happening somewhere else entirely. It is happening within the empath. They are no longer emotionally dependent on whether the avoidant pursues them or not. Their peace no longer depends on the next message or the next moment of closeness. Their self-worth is no longer suspended between periods of silence and brief connection. Most importantly, they have stepped out of the role of managing the entire relationship. They are no longer responsible for translating mixed signals, softening every emotional gap, or carrying the weight of connection for two people. Their stability now comes from within, and that is the shift that changes the relationship more than anything else ever could. The mind starts paying closer attention the moment the emotional system is no longer constantly flooded with certainty. A subtle shift happens beneath the surface. When something is always available, the nervous system eventually stops monitoring it because it feels permanent. It becomes part of the background. But once that availability is no longer guaranteed, the brain naturally begins to reassess its value. This usually happens quietly through increased attention, comparison, and a growing awareness of what seems to be missing or changing. This is where many people misunderstand how these dynamics work. They believe that offering more love, more reassurance, and more emotional openness will automatically create greater security. They assume that the more effort they give, the closer the relationship will become. But in many avoidant attachment patterns, endless emotional availability can actually remove the very tension that keeps the connection psychologically engaging. When there is nothing left to question, anticipate, or pursue, the emotional system gradually loses its sense of contrast. That does not mean the relationship lacked meaning or that the other person was unimportant. It simply means that certain attachment systems stop actively noticing what feels permanently guaranteed. Over time, predictability becomes expectation rather than appreciation. Everything begins to shift when the empath, who once overgave, over-explained, remained available for too long, and carried far more emotional responsibility than they should have, starts becoming more intentional with their energy. This is not dramatic. It is not cold or designed to punish anyone. It is simply a quiet decision to stop investing where there is no mutual effort. The avoidant slowly realizes that emotional access is no longer automatic. What was once freely available now depends on consistency, presence, and genuine participation. That introduces an unfamiliar experience, limits, and limits change perception. When something is no longer endlessly available, its value becomes much more noticeable. What once blended into the background suddenly stands out because it is no longer overflowing. This is why the situation is often mistaken for manipulation, even though it is not. It is not emotional withdrawal meant to provoke pursuit. It is not a strategy for creating jealousy or control. Manipulation always has a hidden objective. What is happening here is something entirely different. It is healthy self-correction. The empath is no longer carrying emotional responsibilities that belong to both people. Their compassion has not disappeared. Their ability to love deeply remains the same. What has changed is their willingness to abandon themselves to maintain the relationship. The avoidant often senses that difference, even if they cannot explain it. There is a clear contrast between someone stepping back to force closeness and someone stepping back because they refuse to keep participating in an emotionally one-sided dynamic. One creates temporary tension that can be relieved with reassurance or brief attention. The other changes the relationship itself because emotional access is no longer assumed. It becomes something that reflects consistent behavior. Communication changes too. There is no emotional chaos, no endless conversations searching for answers, and no repeated attempts to make someone understand what they have repeatedly chosen not to understand. Instead, feelings are expressed calmly and honestly one time. After that, the focus shifts away from explanations and toward actions. The empath begins to recognize an important truth. Love without consistency cannot create emotional safety. It creates dependence on unpredictability, and unpredictability eventually becomes emotionally exhausting rather than romantic. Because of that realization, they stop trusting promises without action. They stop resetting the relationship every time reassuring words appear. They stop falling in love with potential while ignoring reality. They also stop confusing emotional intensity with emotional dependability. Instead, they observe, quietly, consistently. They invest less attention in what might happen and much more attention in what repeatedly does happen. When actions fail to match words, they naturally adjust their investment, not to punish anyone, but because reality deserves an honest response. There is no dramatic goodbye, no emotional speech, no desperate attempt to force understanding. There is simply a gradual release from emotional dependence on inconsistency. That is usually when the avoidant notices the greatest shift, not during conflict or emotional breakdown, but through changing access. The relationship no longer runs on autopilot. It now reflects behavior. Everything begins to feel different. What once seemed endlessly available now has healthy structure. What once accepted every inconsistency now has boundaries. What once required no reflection now asks for awareness. The avoidant is no longer functioning inside the same emotional environment. Unlimited access no longer exists without responsibility. Distance no longer carries no consequences. The relationship no longer bends endlessly around inconsistency. As that adjustment takes place, something meaningful develops. The connection becomes more authentic, not necessarily easier or more comfortable, but more grounded in reality instead of assumptions. Whether that leads to a healthier relationship or greater distance depends on one question alone. Can consistency replace expectation as the foundation of the bond? This is often the point where the avoidant starts leaning back toward the connection. They become more attentive, their responses increase, their presence feels more noticeable. Not because they have suddenly transformed emotionally, but because the relationship itself has changed. The emotional support they quietly depended on is no longer constantly available. The regular check-ins, the endless patience, the gentle understanding, and the emotional labor that once absorbed every inconsistency have become more balanced. As that steady stream begins to fade, an emotional vacuum naturally appears, and that vacuum draws their attention. Still, it is important not to mistake this for automatic growth. In many cases, what is happening is recalibration rather than deep emotional insight. The system is adapting to a new emotional reality, not necessarily developing lasting emotional maturity. The most significant transformation is happening somewhere else. It is happening within the empath. They are no longer emotionally dependent on whether the avoidant reaches out. Their peace is no longer tied to the next text message or the next brief moment of closeness. Their sense of worth no longer rises and falls with someone else's inconsistency. Most importantly, they have stepped out of the role of emotional caretaker. They are no longer responsible for managing the relationship, explaining silence, translating mixed signals, or carrying emotional weight for two people. Their stability now comes from within themselves, and that inner shift changes the relationship far more profoundly than any pursuit ever could. The real victory is not making an avoidant come back. It is becoming so emotionally grounded that your peace no longer depends on someone else's inconsistency. When you stop overfunctioning and start honoring your own worth, every relationship is forced to reveal its true foundation. If you found this video valuable, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us here on RAUL Effect for more insights into attachment, relationships, and emotional psychology.